It's a peculiar thing, but I have this belief that there are certain risks that even the richest people cannot afford to take. And then people pause, like, what do you mean?
What is the biggest secret about generational wealth that most people miss?
Money exists in a context. There's no money that exists in a complete vacuum, right?
Right.
And there are emotional levels to it, but at just the importance to you, right? So when I'm thinking about what you referred to as, generational wealth, it's any money that can be passed on. Whatever allowed them to create that business back then doesn't apply today. The circumstances have changed. There might be more competition. Some things might be more expensive. Some things there are too many choices. You just wouldn't be able to create the same kind of business. But that person, the entrepreneur, and I'm guilty as anybody else here, but has to imagine that creating that business all over again would be almost impossible. And if so, the wealth that you have today might not be the wealth that's worth risking.
Guys, let me tell you a 30-second story, and I promise you won't regret it. So when I started to take investing seriously, I really didn't have anyone to discuss my ideas with. I knew no one in the investing space, and therefore my process felt kind of lonely and very slow as well. So I went on and found a community of serious microcap investors, people that actually like doing the work. And I'll let you in on a little secret. It's called microcapclub.com. Members have profiled more than 1,300 companies, and over 300 of those have gone on to become multi-baggers. That's the power of this group. The awesome thing is that you'll get exposed to ideas well before institutions ever notice them. And if you want to find great businesses and surround yourself with some of the best investors in the world, head to microcapclub.com and consider applying to join or becoming a subscriber. That's microcapclub.com. Nothing in this conversation is financial advice. I may hold positions in some of the companies we discussed or have other interests. I always aim to stay objective, but please take everything with a grain of salt and do your own research.
What is the biggest secret about generational wealth that most people miss?
To give your audience a bit of a background, well, first of all, thank you for having me second time around. I see how much you've enjoyed podcasting and all the incredible guests you've had since we spoke, I think, a year and a half ago. I know we stayed in touch, but I admired from afar how much you've grown as a podcaster and all the wonderful people you've had. I manage money for families. So I fell in love with investing when I was 21, and I picked up a book, One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. By the way, there's a wonderful interview with Peter Lynch that just came out, and it's called, it's on The Compound and Friends. Josh Brown hosted him. And I highly recommend it for people that are familiar with Peter Lynch. I picked up this book. I studied business, economics, political science, but I couldn't bring it all together. And picking up that book opened my eyes to the idea of investing from a whole different perspective than anybody else has ever told me before. And just to give you more of a time and setting here, I was learning about investing when the dot-com bubble burst. And it's not really the time when the professors would tell you, go out and look for stocks to invest. This was the time when they were telling me how terrible some of those businesses were. And especially Amazon was really hated on by a lot of my professors who probably lost money in the dot-com bubble. People might forget or not remember, but Amazon went from $108 to $8 at the time. So I discovered investing, and I fell in love with the idea, the intellectual pursuit that it presented. And to follow up on your question here, I came to New York. So I was born in Poland, went to schools around Europe. The book I found was in Brussels in an English language bookstore that's apparently closed now. Went to grad school in Paris and then came to New York. And I was very fortunate to have my first experience, real career, professional experience at a firm that had a long heritage of managing money for wealthy families around the world. And that firm was... had its roots that dated back to many different reincarnations of Wall Street firms that went back with different senior partners that worked for different firms before. So there was a lot of knowledge and heritage, and you could walk around and ask people questions. I was 20-something, and I was working with 80-year-olds that remembered the Great Depression and the 70s. So I was learning things from books like all of us, but I was also listening to stories. What I learned at that firm, to bring it back to your question, was
Yes,
there are people behind the portfolios. And I think it's a very profound truth that some of us choose to discover at some point, that yes, you're picking stocks. Yes, you're managing money. Yes, you're trying to grow it from one number to the other. but they're actual humans with a heartbeat, with a story, with emotions, with everything they are willing to share with you. So I grew to appreciate it. And then I realized we're trying to take a long-term view on some investments, and it's only possible in a certain setting. And those families had what I grew to appreciate and maybe eventually label properly an infinite investment horizon, an open-ended investment horizon, a horizon where there's actually no end to it because you're managing money not just for this generation, but for generations to come. So if you're asking about the biggest secret, I think it's that revelation and the answer to the big question, what is your investment time horizon? And I asked that question seriously, not just when people say, I'm thinking long term, and they say, a few quarters. I'm thinking about an honest assessment of the money we're talking about, whatever amount it is. What's the time horizon? I think that's the biggest secret. Once you realize it's a very long term investment time horizon, a lot of opportunities unlock that are not available for most people.
Wow, that's so powerful. I think, just from what I understand, essentially your framing or the horizon you have is the biggest component in building generational wealth, which is, I mean, it makes sense at some level, but when people think about generational wealth, maybe they think more of, let's say, Jeff Bezos or I don't know, Bill Gates, who built like something which grew really really fast, and then it became so big that it will last for generations. But from what I'm hearing, essentially the more common path is to actually build it slow, or like have a sort of longer term horizon, and keep that wealth over a long term. So maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but um, yeah, just would love to hear your thoughts on what I said.
David, to me, the big revelation is that no matter what the amount is, it's important to the owner.
Yes.
It could be $1,000, but it's the only $1,000 that you might have, let's say, working a summer job and saving everything you could. That's the only $1,000 that you have. So it's incredibly important to you. It might be actually more important to you in that moment than $1 million investment account that you have at the age of 45. So money exists in a context. There's no money that exists in a complete vacuum, right? And there are emotional levels to it, but at just the importance to you, right? So when I'm thinking about what you refer to as, generational wealth, it's any money that can be passed on. In my book, Money, Life, Family, I mentioned a story. In my family, there's a piece of land, nothing really significant in the grand scheme of things. But that piece of land was bought by my great grandparents and divided into two pieces, and different family members lived on different parcels of it. And that piece of land is still in the family, uninterrupted. So you could date back multiple generations because the great grandparents hosted their parents and their grandparents on that piece of land in a home that no longer exists. There are other properties that were built on it. Again, it's not a big piece of land. Just the heritage and the continuity through generations and through, at the time, the period between two world wars, World War II, half a century of communism in Poland, and everything that followed the last 35 years of massive growth. And the land is still there, right? So it's generational. It's nothing to write. Well, I wrote it in a book about it in a book, so I guess you could write books about it. But I wanted to show a thread through history, right? So there might be something in your family. It could be a watch. It could be a jewelry box. It could be a painting. It could be a book that is passed on and becomes something that outlasts one lifetime and continues. I think money is such a peculiar concept that sometimes you have to leave that space and look at it from the outside to appreciate what we're talking about. And to me, it's a never-ending, fascinating pursuit of understanding money as such. And the podcast, Talking Billions, if anything, gives me the permission to explore more. But think about knowledge. Like you and I sitting today here, Morgan Housel brought it to my attention in one of his recent episodes, how more people are reading Seneca or Plato today than there were people reading Plato when he was around or listening to him, because I don't think he probably listening to him more than reading. But the fact that more people are exposed to the ideas of Plato today around the globe at any given point in time than when they lived. So you have this multi-generational, almost at a civilization kind of level, continuity of knowledge. Obviously, there are books we lost. There were libraries that got burned down. There's a lot of works that got translated and survived in another language, but not the original, and on and on and on. But you and I show up on this planet at different points in time, and we inherit a couple millennia of accumulated knowledge.
Yes.
And I'm not just talking about physics, science, but human behavior, storytelling, Greek and Roman plays, how they're structured, theater. It all resonates through how a TV show is made on Netflix today. The structures and the ideas date back, right? So we have this incredible heritage on the wisdom and knowledge side. But on the money side, somehow a lot of us start almost with zero every single generation. I'll pause here.
That's so. First of all, you're such a great storyteller. Because I don't know, just have a calm voice and you really have a good flow, and you know how to captivate people. So I was just like super hooked to the story. So I guess that also helps in your podcast pursuit and writing books and all of that. And I think it's a common theme among your listeners. They always comment on your calm voice. So
Thank you.
yeah, it's super cool. But now, with that tangent aside, I'd like to understand, why do so many families lose their wealth within a few generations?
A family fortune is a miracle when you really think about it. I sit down with clients and sometimes I say, let's just pause for a second. It's a miracle that there's anything for us to talk about on the financial side. There are a lot of other things to talk about, but the money aspect, because in many cases, those families had to move. They had businesses that were successful, then they went bust, and all kinds of stories, if you actually care to ask and listen. But that family fortune might have outlasted it all, one way or the other. And I wrote Money Life Family, trying to distill why they survived. But you're talking about the loss. Almost everything is against that family fortune. And if it's not coming from within the family, all kinds of conflict and friction and so on, then it's from the outside. Taxation throughout history. And we've had a lot of peace in Europe, but not all of Europe in the last few decades. But it's not really the record even for the European continent. You're in Portugal. I was born in Poland. I've lived half of my life in the United States. But there are many times around the whole globe, and I have listeners in 150 countries, and they make me very aware of it. People have been moved, they had their wealth confiscated, they had their wealth taxed away, stolen, and on and on and on. So once you have substantial wealth throughout history, there's always somebody that will find a way to take it from you. There's always that danger. Even recently, I talked to a family that regained control over some inheritance that they lost in recent years. So those things happen. So you're up against a lot. There are a lot of things you can control, especially within the family. And I talk a lot about the communication, making the next generation aware and preparing the next generation. I'm sure we'll talk more about it. But then from the outside, you can optimize some things. Like you can think about the tax setup, the location of the wealth, and how it's invested. At the end of the day, the families I work with, they're up against a fascinating challenge and opportunity. They have the wealth, right? So then they have the time, the open-ended investment horizon. The rate of return is not as important when you really think about it. They definitely don't want to lose it. It's the money they can't afford to lose, but it's the money they don't immediately need. They can really think long-term. And this money has to be invested in a productive way. I happen to like the stock market, and I see the stock market as a place where you can buy small pieces of businesses. We'll talk more about it. Peter Lynch is thinking, but not only him. So you have the vehicle that could serve you, right? And the US, Europe is playing its role, but the US has created learned on the Dutch experience, the Dutch Republic, and the securities, and what a stock is, and a joint stock company, all those things. But the US was really able to create a 200-year plus space for family wealth to continue. Europe, a lot of interruptions, but the US had the stock market for a long period of time. And I still happen to believe it's one of those places where a family fortune has a chance to perpetuate and grow within that vehicle. But you can take it in either any direction you want.
Sure. Yeah. But I want to double click still on this topic because I feel like focusing on the downside is always the wisest thing to do. And can you give us some practical examples or some more concrete examples of how families commonly lose their wealth or make mistakes when passing on wealth?
A lot of the challenges come from within. The family cannot agree. And one of the solutions I've seen is dividing up the fortune, which undermines the power of that fortune to begin with, into pieces that are manageable. I think that the simplest way to look at it. If you look at some of the wealthiest families that have public record of their wealth, there are a lot of families that are very wealthy that nobody knows about. They are the invisible wealth that I wrote about not long ago. But the families, the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies of the world and the Rockefellers, there's a lot that was written about them. At some point, you have to divide it up to a unit that's manageable. And some families can manage as a whole large institution and build into a family office that has, thousands of family members and so on. Other families cannot. But finding that, what's the family unit that can really successfully manage a family fortune? So that's the first secret. The second one is truly appreciating what we started with, which is the time horizon. Think of it, any idea you have, ask yourself, is it a good idea over 100 years? So you tell me, I want to have all my money in cash. And I say, okay, I hear you, David, but what's your time horizon? If your time horizon is until you buy a car next month, I think it's a good idea. Keep it all in cash. But if you tell me you have a family inheritance of $10 million and you have a time horizon of at least 50 years, then I would say maybe it's not the best idea to keep it in cash. Inflation has consumed more wealth than almost anything, apart from wars and actual confiscation. But inflation is something that's very real, and we're feeling it around the globe more so in the last few years than in a while. So that's something that happens. So you have the family unit, you have how this money is invested, and then it's a peculiar thing, but I have this belief that there are certain risks that even the richest people cannot afford to take. And then people pause, like, what do you mean? So I'm sure you've heard stories of those billionaires out there that took disproportionate risks with huge leverage. And whether it was financial leverage with financial instruments or a lot of debt in their operating business, and went from many billions to zero or a negative net worth. So that's the point I'm making, that no matter how much money it is, it can be gone in an instant with a handful of very irresponsible decisions, right? So that's something that a lot of people have experienced, and I think there are ways to stay out of it. There's no shortage of trouble, and taxation and regulation, and hopefully we don't have more conflicts, but there are ongoing conflicts around the world. But there are places on the planet that still allow for that wealth to last. And always ask yourself, what about 100 years? I think the challenge that we see is appreciating the difference between wealth creation and wealth preservation. When I say preservation, it doesn't mean it's stuck in time. It's actually growing and compounding. I've seen family fortunes double and double and double again, just invested in a disciplined way over a long period of time. No matter what the actual annual rate of return is, it's kind of secondary, it continues to double. So if you have that open-ended time horizon, there's a lot that you can do. Now, there are many places and many situations and many circumstances that will allow you to create wealth. Smaller, bigger, create wealth, right? But there are fewer places that will allow you to keep it. And I think that's a realization that some individuals just have to come to on their own. I'll add one last thing, it's such a good thread. But I noticed, especially with the first generation that creates substantial wealth, until they realize that they could lose it all, they're not really ready to think about a multi-generational pursuit. I'll tell you why.
Tell me.
They have this thought that they created a business, sometimes 30 years ago from nothing. Sometimes it was the back of the car and a folder and a couple of ideas. And I have a lot of admiration, and I love hearing those stories. But I think we both ignore for a second that whatever allowed them to create that business back then doesn't apply today. The circumstances have changed. There might be more competition. Some things might be more expensive. Some things there are too many choices. You just wouldn't be able to create the same kind of business. But that person, the entrepreneur, and I'm guilty as anybody else here, but has to imagine that creating that business all over again would be almost impossible. And if so, the wealth that you have today might not be the wealth that's worth risking. And that's a realization. I've met a lot of people who see that, and it's for them second nature. And I've also met some individuals that believe, even later in their life, that if they lost it all, they can make it all back. It's very hard to give any advice to someone who believes that they can. And I wish them all the best. I hope they can, if that's the case. But I think they're willing to accept risks that they can't really afford to take. And they have to see it on their own. Does that make sense? It's all about what you talked about, which is managing actual risk. Risk not as in volatility, but risk as in a chance of parting with an entire amount that you have, or if it's significant enough portion of it that you can't recover in a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And one of the things that fascinates me is, how can you tell someone that basically conquered his world, or in his mind he's like, yeah, he admires himself so much because he built something important, and the people around him admire him, and maybe his family as well. And how do you teach him that maybe he's wrong? So I think that's so fascinating, and maybe you can give me some comments on that, because I feel sometimes the same with CEOs. Obviously, I know nothing compared to them, but from outside, you always have like a different perspective and maybe some feedback that can be constructive and maybe not. But it's really hard to kind of, transmit it in a way that the other person, or you at least feel that the other person is considering it.
I think teaching is very hard. I have a lot of respect for teachers. I think it's a calling, and I think some things almost cannot be taught. And maybe it goes back deeper that, I like this idea that the cheapest mistakes are the ones that somebody makes and you just learn from their mistakes. But we're humans, and I don't want to say we love making mistakes, but no matter what, we want to make mistakes that have already been made.
Yeah.
And, reading books, asking people, listening to this podcast, listening to what other people have done, makes you realize, wow, there's certain mistakes that repeat and repeat, repeat. And then maybe it's not worth making them, but it's a realization that you have to come to on your own. That's why a teacher has a tough role, because they can show you things, but you're the one that has to make the last step. You can't really force knowledge like that on anybody, which is fascinating. So that's why there are moments where I realize that either somebody comes to some realizations on their own and they can read and listen, but I can't bring them to that realization from the simplest idea, price and value, what it means, or what risk is, or if they can afford to take certain risks. It's a realization. But I think the bigger picture and the bigger question you're asking is, when a family member or a part of the family realizes that whatever wealth they've built so far is not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of many generations to come. And I see that in their eyes, in their body language, in the words that they use, that they saw it. And that's a fascinating place. And I've had clients who at some point told me, whatever money you're managing, it's no longer for me. It's for my kids and grandkids. Now, by extending that investment horizon, I think they can also benefit in their lifetime. I think there's a huge bonus there. But it's their realization that this is the money that they're leaving, even if legally and on paper it's not yet in the name of the beneficiary. Psychologically, emotionally, that money has already changed hands. And it's a bigger topic of a gift. How do you give something to somebody else? I like the idea of a gift with warm hands. So it's not just the amount, but also the context of how you pass it along. See, you pick up a book in Brussels when you're 20 that's called One Up on Wall Street, and you think you're going to learn how to invest. And once you dive into it the way I have over the last 2 decades, you realize it's a human experience, and the topic is so much deeper, broader, and richer than the idea of buying a stock that goes from 1 to 2.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. And again, the human aspect of everything is so important, and it sounds even more important when managing literally everything for other families. So yeah, I think we already touched on how to kind of keep wealth, how to avoid losing it, but we have yet to talk about building wealth that lasts, right? So what have you learned from your experience with interacting with these families and so on? What are the first principles someone needs to understand if they really want to build wealth that lasts?
So let's assume we have a family that gets along. Let's assume everybody's on the same page. Let's assume that the money is also in a place on earth where you can actually perpetuate that wealth, which is a handful of places, the US and then parts of Europe and maybe a few places in Asia, where you won't have, currency crisis and all kinds of other things that can completely disrupt whatever you've been working on. We see places even today that are going for a lot of trouble on that front yet again. So once you have all of that arranged, you have a framework that could work, and you need to deploy this money in a productive way. I think the catch is that a lot of people assume that they have this open-ended time horizon and they can get disproportionately aggressive, disproportionately creative, and take all those risks. Actually, I think I'll make it more relatable to people. Like sometimes people say that if you're younger, then you can take bigger risks. And to me, it's you take different risks when you're 20, you take different risks when you're 40, and you take different risks when you're 60. But the money that you saved, you talked about this $1,000 that I saved after a few summer jobs. That money is a fortune to you, right? So you treat it the same way you're going to treat one day. I wish you receive a huge inheritance one day, a $10 million inheritance. You're going to treat it the same way, right? But when you think on a human level, the way you would respond to it, right? So when people say, you're younger than go out, take bigger risks. Yes, you'll take different risks. But the money context, you don't want to lose that $1,000 that it took you the entire summer to earn, right? And I think that stays with us, and we can apply it. There's a beautiful book called Brewster's Millions. It's a 100-year-old book. I brought it up a few times. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a story from 100 years ago, New York City. This younger person in a New York career finds out that he is about to receive an inheritance from one family member. But there's a catch. He has to lose it. Not buy silly things, but absolutely lose it all to receive the 10 times larger inheritance from another family member. Yet another example of families not getting along, by the way. And he goes ahead and spends a whole year trying to lose that money, which he learns that even with silly moves and silly ideas, it's very hard to lose money. I think there's a lesson there. But once he actually parts with it entirely, he's finally ready for the large inheritance. And I think there's a bigger lesson there, because I think what we can learn with the first $1,000 or first 10,000, whatever it is, can teach us a lot when a large amount comes to our life. I bring it up because families will have more and more inheritance going forward. There has been an incredible amount of wealth created around the world. And what you and I have read about Vanderbilt 150 years ago, what they experience, more families will experience. That's why this conversation is so timely and so relevant in so many more households than ever before. What I see with the families I've worked with, their lessons and their observations apply to so many more families these days, because there will be even more families that will inherit something, and they will be facing very similar challenges to the Vanderbilts and everybody else in between. The size doesn't matter. The context will matter, how the family gets along, how this money is passed on, how it's given, and how it's invested. Now, the stock market happens to be an incredible vehicle that allows us to perpetuate wealth, and I'm sure we'll dive in more, but I'll pause here.
Yeah, I really want to ask you, why do we want to pass wealth in the first place? Like, I mean, there are some obvious reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
But why is this so obvious?
Well, let's pause for a second and ask this question in another way. There are certain gifts that you received from your family that are not monetary, right? You might have felt loved, approved, admired. Maybe some skills were passed on to you. Maybe it's one of your family members that showed you how to ride a bicycle. Maybe somebody read to you a book. Maybe that's why you started reading, pirate books as a kid, like I did. Who knows, right? So we receive a lot of different values, experiences, tangible, intangible, from our family, but not just family. It could be a neighbor. It could be somebody in your circle growing up. We receive a lot of things. Money is just one of the things we may or may not receive, right? So when we think about the human experience, we talked about knowledge. We accumulate knowledge. It's a never-ending process, right? We keep on learning. Knowledge is fascinating because we kind of undo and redo, right? Like there's some theories in math and physics that were undone with new ones. But anyways, they take us on a path of learning, and there are a lot of things that we receive. So when we talk about money here, think of everything else that you've been given. And isn't it beautiful that you didn't start on Earth without knowing what a language is, without knowing what a written word is, without knowing what gravity is? Imagine that we wipe out the entire human knowledge with every single generation, and we say, David, go out there and figure it out. And figure out which fruit and veggie is edible and which one will cause stomachache or worse, right? Go out there and see what's edible in the woods. We don't do it. We grow up watching other people live their lives. Obviously, these days, you don't have to figure out what's edible. You assume if it's at your supermarket, it's edible, unless it's expired. Although your grandma or somebody in your family probably shows you how to look at the expiration date on any product. So we are given all those things. Money is just one of the things. But somehow, David, money is something that triggers us, an avalanche of emotions. And that's why it's both hard to give, and I'll dare to say that sometimes it's even harder to receive money.
I think that's true. I think it's especially, maybe if you're born with it, I'm making an assumption here or a theory, but maybe if you're born with it, you just accept it because it's your reality. But if you all of a sudden receive it, I don't know if there's some difference in there. Maybe you can help me out here.
There's a beautiful book that was written as a PhD dissertation a couple of decades ago. It's called The Inheritance Experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the name is escaping me, but people can look it up. It's probably public domain. You can find it, or somebody wrote about it. But the researcher who grew up in a wealthy family, Bronfman, and first name forgetting, it's going to come back to me. Anyways, wonderful book, wonderful read. But she asked people that grew up with a lot of wealth what it was like. There's so much in that book, but I'll point out one thing. Any life that you've had so far, or any childhood experience you've had, a lot of people, and I did too, assume that everybody grew up the way you did. I grew up in communist Poland, the last decade of an economic experiment, very peculiar time. I didn't know at the time that there was anything different or wrong with that. I assumed that all the kids around the world, including David in Portugal, is growing up the same way I did. In my case, everything was owned by the government. You had to line up in front of stores that were empty and get paper cards from the government to get the permission to buy anything because there was a shortage of things. And I had fun with it, and I was listening to stories that my grandpa was telling me. I had no idea that I'm deprived of anything, and I had no idea that my upbringing is so different than the upbringing of most of the people that I'll meet in my life after I leave Poland. And the book that I'm talking about says the exact same truth about a whole different experience. This woman writes and says, everybody that grows up with a lot of wealth, however you define it, assumes that it's human experience, that everybody else is also growing up with that, right? So it's almost like you're a fish in a pond. You can't explain to a fish what a pond is unless the fish leaves the pond. For me, I had to leave Poland and communism had to end for me to realize what an absurd childhood it was. But as a kid, I had no idea. And I think that's the realization she had, that, you know, we grow up with certain circumstances and we don't take this introspective, take when we look outside at our life and say, wow, my life is so different than David's life. And we start to evaluate, and this is better. I like David's school more than I like mine, but I really don't like, where David goes and swims in a cold river, but I like something else. I could choose and pick from other people's experience. Anyways, all this to say, no matter if you grow up with a lot or a little, you have to integrate this experience with who you are. I have a good mentor and friend, James Hughes, who wrote quite a few books, and he has advised many wealthy families around the globe. Wonderful human being, but he has this idea, which I think is one of the biggest challenges for people, and I think will continue to be so even for more households. It's what he calls the integration. So somebody that's born into a family with substantial wealth at some point has to integrate this phenomenon with their human experience, right? So you have the family and the individual, and then the individual within the family. And it doesn't just apply to money, but since we're picking on money today, the money experience has a huge impact. Not having it, having it, and wishing didn't have it, and not having it and wishing you had it. You can build a matrix of all different scenarios. Either way, you have to accept and then choose what you're going to do with it and how you're going to act about it going forward.
I kind of knew that from intuition, because I have friends across all like social kind of backgrounds, and the ones that happen to be richer or like extremely poor, they just think that's, I mean, with social media now it's a bit different for the poor, but for the really rich ones, it's like, okay, this is just my life, and it's super normal, and everyone, and it's kind of hard for them to comprehend that maybe other people can't afford to do the same things they do, right? So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think human nature is so fascinating, and the fact that someone actually did the work and studied that it's fascinating. So I'll ask you for the name later. Maybe I'll include that in the description so people can check it out. Yeah, but the other point I wanted to talk about, when it comes to passing on wealth, building wealth, and so on, does this create freedom or more responsibility? Because there are so many variables and you have to be aware of so much, and like, I don't know, it just feels so complicated.
So I want to zoom out, because it's one of those things I think that are easier to see once you zoom out. So in a society with some economic activity, there are services provided, goods provided, and some people choose to provide them, right? Like the free market economy. And eventually the ones that are better at it or found something that people want will start to accumulate wealth. And it's been happening throughout the recorded history, even through the times with kings and queens, where actually it was a group of people that had wealth that the kings they're taking out loans from the wealthy. Mm-hmm. It happened throughout history. Bottom line, this will continue to happen. I think what we're seeing now is that there's even more wealth created. I think there are more opportunities to create wealth. There are more opportunities to sell and offer to the greater world your services. And I think with obviously internet, including this conversation, is a lot, enabled by the internet.
Yeah.
More and more ways to create wealth, and more ways to provide valuable services. And I think it's overall it's great and wonderful because it's a form of self-expression. If I want to be a baker, I want to be in a country where I can be a baker, right? If I want to be a writer, I want to be in a country that I can be a writer. And then if more people read your books in more countries, then you're more successful. Eventually you become a best-selling author. Hopefully that's what I would wish for you. But anyways, the wealth gets accumulated, but our lifetime is limited. And I think that's what we're touching on, back to what we started with. If you accumulate, if you're successful financially speaking, because there are many different ways to be accomplished in life, but if you're financially successful, then the wealth gets accumulated. And at some point, how the story goes, when somebody passes away and somebody asks, how much did he leave? And somebody says, all of it, right? That's the point, right? Like at the day we pass away, we leave all of it behind. And then the big question arises, what's next, right? And that wealth is not in a bank account. I think that's where the confusion is. The wealth, or the net worth that we've been so obsessed about the last half a century maybe, the net worth is in something. It's in businesses. It's in businesses that employ people. These could be individual, privately held large businesses, but this could be a collection of 30 stocks that represent ownership in 30 businesses. You're not the only shareholder, but one of many. And let's say somebody passes away. There's a stock portfolio. Who gets it next, right? Back in the day, would maybe go to the king, maybe would go to taxation and we be distributed, but it doesn't disappear. I think that's what people, and I maybe requires an additional explanation. It doesn't disappear. The owner is gone, but the minute Vanderbilt died, the original Vanderbilt died, his railroad operations didn't disappear; they continued, right? So you have to have the owners that will follow. And it's a question, do you think the state, the government, would be the better owner of these assets? Or do you think some individuals can continue to hold it? And you could argue both sides. I think since I grew up in a communist country where the government owns everything, I think you know how I feel about it. I think the government plays a certain helpful role in some fields and not so good in other ones. And I think the ownership should remain with individuals, humans with a heartbeat. And the question is, who do you pass it on to? And it's your choice. It's David's fortune, right? You have your $1 billion. You can give it to charity. You can give it to your kids. You can leave it to your nephews. You can divide it up the way you want. And it's passed on to somebody else. So the phenomenon of wealth creation is not going to go away. The phenomenon of us eventually leaving this planet will continue as well. So the transfer of wealth will exist in the future. Maybe some of it will be taken care of by taxation. But what is really taxation of inherited wealth? So let's say that, the tax is, 10%, 20, 50. Some countries have higher tax rates. What really happens? You're forced to sell shares of a company to pay the tax bill. But the business itself doesn't disappear. It's the owner the ownership that gets transferred, right? So the government wants the 40%, 400 million of your billion, and the 400 million worth of shares gets sold to the public. So you basically change the owner. The owner is not the family. The owner is not really the government. The owner is whoever else has the cash available to buy the shares. So to me, it's like when people say that the money was lost, it's never actually really lost, especially in this case. It just changes hands, and it depends on your system of beliefs and your preferences and the setting you operate in. Who is the end owner? Do you know what I mean? Like the wealth doesn't disappear. It will be passed on. And the only way to stop it is to stop wealth creation. But stopping wealth creation means not allowing people to do whatever they love to do. This podcast may make you the richest person in Portugal. Who am I to say you shouldn't have a podcast, right? Like, think about it, right? Like, David should be allowed to become the best podcast host in all of Portugal or Europe or the world. There you go.
Yeah, sure. I don't know about that, but Yeah, it's cool to think about it anyway. Um, so you grew up in Poland, communist
Yes.
Poland. You worked and lived half of your life in the US, and you worked with families from multiple geographical backgrounds. So, how do different cultures, how do different countries view wealth differently?
So over the years, I made friends around the globe in on all continents, and I find it fascinating because there's some stories that repeat. The risks that were taken to create the wealth, the realization that they want to keep the wealth over multiple generations. So those things rhyme. You can meet a family in the other part of the world and have a fascinating dinner with them. And you change the names, you change the locations, that the same story can be told in a Manhattan restaurant with people that grew up outside of New York. It doesn't really matter, which is fascinating how much these individuals and those families have in common across the globe. And I think we all do have a lot more in common than we think. Now, the challenge is that I think there are certain lessons that some continents were able to embrace better than the other ones. And it's just an observation, no judgment. I think the way the United States has been set up as a place where people go to follow their dreams, it's a place that a lot of people were not born. They came to, including myself. And if not, then a generation or two back, a lot of people can trace their ancestry to somebody that came. There's a lot of acceptance of mistakes and failure and risk taking in the US that I experience. And there are other parts of the world, but let's pick on, a large country with, 300 million people. Europe, where I spent half of my life, and I went to schools in Brussels and Paris and Poland, and I made friends, and I continue to visit Europe. I really enjoy Europe, and Portugal is a beautiful country, by the way.
Visit, please.
So, isn't it right? And then you notice that in Europe, there's a lot of tradition around preserving things. And I'm not just talking about, art, but I think there's a lot of heritage in the families I met that have links to both sides of the Atlantic, just for a minute to focus on this side of the globe. In Europe, I noticed, and I write about it in my books, how Europe has really tried to master the art of preserving wealth, even if it compounds and grows. And the US has really embraced the wealth creation. In Europe, in some places, and that's my experience, a couple of things happen. One, when you take risks and you fail, it's sometimes taken as a judgment on your lifetime ability. So you'd rather not take certain risks. The other thing that I experienced in Europe, and maybe it has changed in the last 2 decades since I lived in the US, but if you're not of a certain age, you can't be in a certain role. I remember just an anecdote. Maybe it has changed. I hope it has. But I remember in my grad school, I was told that, be prepared that you're going to be in investment committee meetings. And until you have some gray hair, you're not supposed to speak up. And 6 months later, I ended up in New York. I'm at an investment firm and I'm pitching one of my first stocks. I'm super excited, as I imagine you would be too. And I'm sitting at a long conference room table and I'm 24 and I'm looking around and everybody's at least twice my age, if not more. Investing is such a pursuit where people work long into their retirement. So we had 80-year-olds and a 90-year-old sitting at the same desk. Fascinating how much they know as a group. So the questions were really great. But it made me realize, look, they gave me all the attention just because I put in the time and effort to write up and research this investment idea. They were not questioning if I'm prepared based on my age or where I came from or the accent I spoke with, which I found fascinating. And there are very few places on earth where I experienced that. So the wealth creation part. Long story short, I think each and every continent has something to offer and we can all learn from each other. And maybe the podcast for me is an excuse to invite people from all over. I had people from all the continents to share what they've learned, because I think if we just listen to each other, we can learn from other people's experience and maybe skip a mistake or two instead of making them on our own.
Nice. I'm glad you mentioned the podcast because I have some selfish questions here
Totally.
I really wanted to learn from you on the podcasting side. So if people are not podcasters, maybe you can skip to the next chapter. But yeah, I'm curious to know why. I mean, you just mentioned one of the reasons why you do the podcast, but what's your why for the podcast?
There are many whys, but to me, it's a continued education for me and for my audience, for my guests. I realized that I think it took me a while to fully appreciate what an incredible medium a podcast is. You have this intimate 1 hour with somebody that you might have admired for a while. You read their books, you've listened to their talks, you might be very familiar with them. But in that 1 hour, I think we can really get a glimpse of their personal story and their personal why. That's why I kick off Talking Billions with the question about childhood and upbringing, because I feel like the seed was planted very early on why we care about something. And I'm sure you can parse and figure out why I do what I do and why I care about the people I work for and how I see investing as a lifelong pursuit because of the upbringing I had. So the podcast opened my eyes to this whole window of opportunity. And I've had the pleasure of talking to authors whose books I was reading when I was 20 and I was discovering investing. And, Robert Hagstrom and his books about Buffett were some of them. And I had a chance to talk to him and record with him. Then to hear the voice and see the person behind the book, that's what the podcast can do. David, when I discovered investing when I was 20 something, I picked up a book One Up on Wall Street with Peter Lynch. And I had to look for another book or another resource to continue to learn. But today, and it's fascinating how many different ways there are for us to continue to learn. And if I was 20 all over again, I would look up podcasts with Peter Lynch, podcasts with Buffett. Then I would discover that Buffett has been posting his annual letters every year. Then I would have discovered that you can look up online the recordings of annual Berkshire Hathaway meetings. I mean, the resources are incredible. It doesn't mean that people are actually using them, but they are available in a way that were not possible. I got to meet people that traveled to Omaha and went to Berkshire meetings when they couldn't even fill up a small room because nobody knew who Buffett was. So, and they told me the stories how you had to call the Berkshire headquarters to have the report sent to them. Anyways, all this to say, podcasting, I think it's a phenomenal way for us to continue to learn and grow. It creates this beautiful ecosystem for me of former guests and friends of my guests. And not a week passes when somebody says you should talk to somebody. And at this point in time, after 180 episodes, I don't really have to look for new guests because I have suggestions coming through an ecosystem of people that already know me. And I'll tell you that it's such a wonderfully curated number of guests and content that allows me to, just show up, prepare, and do that part instead of trying to figure out who should be on the show next, because I know that the next 10 are coming and then the next 10 are coming. The question is, will I have the time for it? But so far, I love it and it brings a lot of joy to my life and it's an inspiration and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Nice. I was about to ask you how do you source your guests, but I guess you don't source them. So,
I have this funnel in a way that keeps on sending people to me. And I want to highlight that I get a lot of pitches when people are trying to sell something, and I say no to those, and they're very marketing driven. I want to hear people. We started with people behind the portfolios, but I want to hear people behind the philosophies, principles, books, stories. And the podcast is meant to be that place, a safe space. I almost see it as like a tea room where every week I show up and I sit by the fireplace and I have a guest. And we're all sipping on some tea. There are lots of chairs available in the room. Just picture an old style New York hotel. And then the doors crack open and you're walking past, you're the audience, right? And you look in and you see, oh, wow, Robert Hagstrom, I've heard of him. And then you grab a seat and you can be a part of it for an hour. That's how I see the podcast. It's a tea room kind of experience of the two of us having a very intimate conversation that would be almost impossible to have anywhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And just like you research stocks, you also have
Mm-hmm.
to research your guests, right? And so,
Yes.
can you give me some tricks or tips on how to research guests?
How to research a guest in a minute or less. How to get rich in a week or less.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to use these as noise sound bites for your episode. I think certain things take time. I think in investing, even if you research a stock in an hour, it takes years for it to really deliver. A lot of the guests, I might have read something about them 10 or 20 years ago, and they have a share of my mind in some way. So a lot of the guests I've known of or known actually in my real life for a long time. I do have this element of surprise and serendipity. And I think that's maybe where the answer might be more helpful for you, where I come across somebody and they say something, write something, or host a podcast, or there's something visible about them that I feel like I really want to talk to that person. And it's a 2-second decision. And I just draft a quick email and I say, listen, I came across this piece. It really resonated. I explained why. And 9 out of 10, I hear it from them. And another 9 out of 10, they actually end up on the podcast. So this is my way of adding to the mix this element of serendipity. And I think what you're doing with your podcast, you're learning in public, which is something that was probably not as common or as available, 20 or 40 years ago. But you expand this kind of a surface. People have different ways to explain it, but it's a surface of David's presence in this virtual world, right?
Yeah.
And it has huge benefits for you in terms of learning, but also people will say, I really like the way David asked that question. I wonder if he would be interested in collaborating on this article, or I wonder if he would be interested in some role at the firm, right? You're creating this higher chance of success, however you want to define it, in your life by being a bit more visible. I'll say one more thing. I had a guest who eventually became a guest on the show, but he told me he doesn't want to do a podcast because he doesn't want to be famous. And I said, I don't think my podcast will make you famous. I think people might recognize you if you go to Omaha, because a lot of people that come to Omaha to listen to Buffett happen to listen to my podcast. But I said, outside of this group of people, if anything, they're kind, sweet human beings that will shake your hand. Nobody will still know who you are. And that's how I think about it, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe in one little universe, people will recognize David here. But you can walk into a store and anywhere else in the world, people don't know who you are. I think there's beauty about it. So don't be afraid when it comes to sharing your content out in the world that you will become famous if it's not something you want. I don't want to be famous, but I want to meet a lot of interesting people. And this podcast adventure allows me to do that. I sign up.
100%. And I can tell my personal story that it took like some of my closest friends more than 1 year to figure out I did this. So if my inner circle can't figure out, then you're safe. Don't worry. Yeah. So it's really funny. Maybe we could wrap up. You gave me one tip before we started recording, and I guess I'll stick to it. Let's start applying some of the practical knowledge from this interview right away. So if you had to leave one lesson, one story for your family 100 years from now, what would it be?
Beautiful question. And I think of the things we write down, and when you share things, even in your lifetime, you realize you're not in the room when people read it. And I've been a lot more careful about how I write in general, because I realize I'm not in the room and I have no way of providing any feedback. But here you're asking about a time horizon. And I sit down with clients and I got to know their parents or grandparents who might not be around. And I play a role that some of my mentors played at different points in time, which I highly admire, which is being that bridge. Your show has the word bridge in it. between generations where I might be the only one in the room that might know what the father or grandfather would say to one particular thing, having known them for so long and so closely. And I think it's a very humbling experience as an advisor to families that you might have that continuity. But in terms of my own family, I tell this story of a certain tree that was planted in a park in a town where my grandparents, one of my parents, my dad, lived growing up. And it's a tree that was planted by my great-grandfather a little bit over 100 years ago. And he was a part of a group of kids from high school that planted a bunch of trees. It's an old oak tree. And I walked past that tree on many occasions. And I never met my great-grandfather. He passed away a few years before I was born. But it's that element of continuity. We talked about money today, but I don't think money is the only vehicle, vessel, thread that you can pull across generations. But to have something, even if it's not physical, it might be a story of a family member that you can pass on. But even, a tree growing in a park or outside of your home, but something that reminds you that you're a part of something. A tree is such a symbolic element and expression here, right? It has its roots. Without the roots, it can't grow, the deeper the roots. So remembering the people that are no longer here, and I have a lot of family members that are no longer with us, and just to think of the role they played in your life. And I'll add one more thing. I mentioned Jay Hughes, who works with families, but he told me this story. And whenever you sit down to dinner with family members, think of who is at the table, then think who is the oldest person, and who was in that person's life that they remember. It might be your great-grandmother or grandmother, and maybe she remembers when she was in a lap of your great-great-grandfather when she was little, right? And to think of how far back you can reach. And then you take the youngest family member at the table and think of how far forward you can look. There might be a 2-year-old sitting at that table that your cousins brought to play. And that 2-year-old can be sitting at a table 100 years from now. I want to bring it up because when people think about long term, it's such a hard concept to embrace. But if you think of it as who are the people that you can actually physically touch, that physically touched or will touch human beings over the next 100 or 150 years.
Isn't it crazy that 80% of you aren't subscribed? So if you made it this far, here's my promise. Follow or subscribe for free, and my team and I will make every episode 1% better. Check out the last episode too if you enjoyed this one, and thank you so much for listening.